How many of you out there like to personalize things about your gaming experience? Whether you enable subtitles or like to meticulously customize your characters, or maybe even secretly turn your brightness all the way up on dark horror games. Believe it or not, all of these are inclusive design decisions. You see, the thing about inclusive game design is that it helps everyone, even those who don't consider themselves as diverse players. I'm Marty Kyle, and I'm a game producer on the Oculus Studios team, where I most recently helped to produce Resident Evil 4 on MetaQuest 2. As a gamer, I benefit from inclusive design all the time. I have a disability that impacts the way that I game, so I know firsthand that inclusive design makes a huge difference in the success of a game. But beyond people like me who need inclusive settings, inclusive design in general is about empowering your players when it comes to how they experience your game. And that affects everyone. Today, I'm joined by my very special guest and my favorite gaming buddy, Tom Ivey, executive producer from Armature Studio on Resident Evil 4. Together, we're going to talk about considerations to help make your game more inclusive, some common pitfalls for designing for diversity, and we'll walk through how we improved features during the development of Resident Evil 4. Tom, welcome to Connect.
Hi, Marty. It's good to be here.
So before we get into the meaty bits of this conversation, I would love to hear a little bit about you and your background.
Sure. I've been in the games industry for 20 years now, first as a designer and now as a producer. And during that time, I've worked on games like Ultima Online, the Metroid Prime series, the Donkey Kong Country Returns series, and most recently, you and I worked together on Resident Evil 4 for the MetaQuest 2. And throughout my career, I've always been interested in the challenges of designing for inclusivity. But in the last few years, that focus has kind of shifted from traditional gaming platforms to this unique landscape of VR. So specifically, I'm interested in the ways that game designers can be more inclusive of a diverse range of audiences, especially when building games that are heavily targeting physical immersion.
Yeah, let's dive right into that.
Sure.
Your career has spanned both massively successful VR and non-VR games. And I remember in all of our conversations throughout development, you were really passionate about that balance of making things immersive, but also making things playable for people who maybe don't have the skills as, say, like a highly trained special agent.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that balance of immersion and usability?
Yeah, absolutely. Game designers have been working on accessibility and inclusive design for years in the non-VR space. And honestly, even with all that work, I think it's still pretty dire. So while you'll have basic accessibility options like color blindness or subtitles or controller rumble, there's still huge issues faced by audiences with accessibility options like limited range of motion or cognitive barriers. And a specific concern for designers in the VR space is that so much of the focus of developing games and experiences for VR has been on this concept of replicating real-world movement, right?
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, that's an amazing goal. When we talk about advancements in VR controls, we've been really dedicated to removing the artificial layer between the player and the game, right? So that's that abstracted controller input we've always had. So you want to grab an item, you have to press an A button. And when you want to move the item, you have to use an analog stick.
Yeah.
Now we're asking players, just reach out with your physical hand, grab the item, and use your arm to move it around in the physical space.
Yes, there's something amazing about that feeling of intense immersion. But to your point, everyone's definition of what's a realistic movement in a realistic game is different.
Yeah, and it's with this kind of heightened desire to make games, quote unquote, more realistic,
Yeah.
right? We're at risk of regressing backwards and once again leaving huge audiences of gamers behind. And a lot of that is simply because we're patterning so much of this realistic movement on a specific type of person and their physical abilities.
Right. I want to dive a little bit deeper into that idea that everyone's designing for, this specific type of person. Usually that type reflects the developers themselves, right? Designing for their own abilities and their own lived experiences. So I want to talk about how we can, move past that to get to those more inclusive designs. I always say that, the best place to start is to have a diverse team. But sometimes, even if you have a diverse team, you can't catch everything.
Yeah, we totally experienced this firsthand at Armature. When we were working on Resident Evil 4, we had a fairly diverse set of developers, right? We had heights ranging from 5 foot tall to 6'5", sizes ranging across hundreds of pounds, across different genders, including several people with limited range of motion and a wide variety of motion sensitivity, right? We had QA testers that could handle smooth turning at like max speed, but also developers that could only play with our teleportation mode.
Yeah, and I remember that in addition to all your internal teams at Armature Studio, on my side at Meta, we organized external testing and white paper groups that actually pushed those ranges even further, including folks who had limited visibility, limited mobility, limited hearing, and other disability groups.
Yeah, and of course, lots of developers don't even have access to that
Yes,
testing.
yeah.
But even if you do, you can still miss the mark.
Mhm.
At Armature, we had really focused on this problem. We had created extra large ranges for grabbing objects, lots of slop room on timings and distance,
Yeah.
and what we thought was a large suite of comfort options to account for a wide variety of body types and motion sensitivity. But there was still a major tenet of designing for accessibility that we had to consider, and that's the intersection of these limitations.
Yes, that point is so important. There are so many people in our spaces that have intersectional identities, including myself. So, for those of you who are new to the concept, I want to give an example of how that can show up when you're testing. In one case, I had a tester who was both colorblind for red-green and also sensitive to intense VR locomotion. And this was a combination that the design just didn't account for because we had a red laser pop up to show you where you were teleporting to in a predominantly green forest environment. So this tester couldn't distinguish the laser from the surrounding visuals. So even when we were planning for inclusive designs, we still built something that was ultimately excluding them from progressing further.
Yeah, exactly. I think there will always be combinations you don't think of,
Yeah.
or a representation that you don't have in house. You're always going to miss. So the question is, how do you focus on missing less? And what do you do after the fact when you get feedback from players about how you miss? So immediately when you ship a game, I think it's incredibly important to actively seek out indications of groups you may have left behind. So I think you'll remember after Resident Evil 4 shipped, we searched for feedback in reviews, in message boards, in social media, in bug submissions. I mean, we looked all over the place. And we started adding tags and tracking trends to get a sense of the types and the scale of problems, but also how they were being encountered. So the point of all that is that we could carry hard data back to the development group about how best to improve the experience for as many players as possible.
Absolutely. I remember those long hours looking through all those feedback forms, and it was so much fun kind of seeing how people were interacting with their games. Sure. But I actually remember the exact feature that we were able to improve with this kind of feedback searching. Our challenge with Resident Evil 4 was that we had to think about how to bring those tried and tested controls from the original game to this new VR version. And a part of that was the holsters for items on Leon's body.
Yeah, I know exactly where you're going with this.
Yeah, so there's this feature where a player can grab items off their chest like a grenade and use them immediately in the heat of the battle. But after we launched, we actually saw user reviews that mentioned that people were still having difficulties grabbing these items.
Yeah. Even with these extra large ranges we built in, which we'd found supported our extended set of testers quite well, it just wasn't enough. So we sat down. We took the feedback and reassessed the design entirely. We thought, why limit the player to some internal number that we think might fit them well? Why not we just put it directly in the player's hands and let them offset the holster positions in any direction, in any distance, so they can put them, exactly where they feel comfortable with them. Even if that might seem like an extreme range to our standard testing group, why? It doesn't matter. Just let them do that. So we worked up that system along with some additional color blindness and movement options, and we released a patch to address the feedback we'd heard.
Yes, that January options patch was so important, to me and also to all of our players. And I think it's so important that we were able to take that step and say, even while we're working on the mercenaries, that these options are important and we need to get this patch out as soon as possible.
Yeah. And I think an equally important point is once you've completed work on a game, to take those learned lessons and package them up as your new base standard for any game moving forward. So that way you're driving into the next project at a better starting point from day one. You have a library of options and understanding and the right questions to ask any new design. The hope is that you've broadened your way of thinking more. You've gotten better at putting yourself into the position of somebody possibly very unlike you. And you're asking the right questions about how your design fits their reality. I think in that way, you're taking the first step in a pattern we should all be striving for, which is designing for inclusion and accessibility from the ground up.
Yes, to me, there's no such thing as like too early for accessibility and inclusion. Honestly, considering, these topics even as early as your conceptualization and your prototyping phase is really the best way to make sure that your game is inclusive through and through.
Yeah, start early at a foundational level. I think that's super important to the things that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. And on that topic, I want to talk a bit about some common game features that you and I see all the time that can actually exclude people from your games if you're not too careful.
Sure.
As more and more VR games come out, I've been starting to see a wide range of apps, from combat to productivity apps, kind of make the same assumptions about their players and implement settings for those assumptions as
Yeah.
if they're like this new standard
Yeah.
for how VR should be, which isn't actually always correct. Maybe we can use the live example of those holsters in RE4 to kind of talk about how we approach this issue.
Yeah, of course. You and I were talking earlier about grabbing items off these holsters on your body
Sure.
and making sure that we allow the player to position these types of interactions well to fit their body shape. But another concern with these types of real world body mappings and movements is thinking about people that have a limited range of motion or a limb difference.
Yeah.
That could range from the inability to turn their head past a certain angle, or move their arms outward or above a certain height, or even just hold grip buttons consistently, or keep their hand in one place, or a complete lack of input from one or both sides. Right?
Absolutely. There's a huge range of what people can or can't do when it comes to those types of interactions. I remember back when I was on the content review team here at Meta, there was a reviewer who couldn't do repetitive, heavy swinging arm motions. And I hadn't realized just how many of our VR games require you to do that in order to complete the game.
Yeah.
So what are some things that our developers can do to make games more accessible to players with these types of mobility restrictions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on Resident Evil 4, we implemented a few solutions to some of these cases. So, for example, for users with limited mobility, we added a quick select menu option in place of these mapping items, the items to your body positions. So in that way, you could just press an analog stick in a direction to select an item. And when you select an item in that way, it would attach to your hand. So it also helped people, that had difficulty holding a grip button consistently.
Yeah.
And while those additions were targeted at accessibility and inclusion, they were also just preferred by many people, regardless of their particular abilities, which is great. That's the point. The more options and control a player has over the way they can play your game, the better. But to be perfectly honest, this is a solution that was targeted at a specific system implementation. So we should also be looking at the fundamental ways we're asking players to move in these spaces and how we can help to support them.
Yes, I know we've said it so many times throughout the session, but these kind of improvements help all players, not just those with disabilities. And to your last point, I know some of these cases are being solved by external tools right now, like devices or applications that do things like allow the player to set a specific offset on their controller positions, or maybe scale their movements so that a small movement reads as a large sweeping movement, or filter their input so that an uncontrollable movement is dampened down.
Yeah, and in many cases, these are very simple solutions, but they can profoundly affect a player's ability to play your game.
Yeah.
But there are very few games or SDK level interfaces that implement these kind of fundamental types of input factors. Instead, I think designers are still targeting a specific system or a behavior in the game that's simply fallout from the fundamental issue of limited mobility. And I think that's often just because many of us are still not aware of the basic issues that are facing these groups. Or we're still just getting better at putting ourselves in their place and asking the hard questions about how our designs are accessible. And I think that comes with time and effort and consistency of action on these types of issues.
Yes, consistency. I love that. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how we can design for accessibility and inclusivity in regards to the way the player character moves or acts in the space. But another common aspect of game design that could be non-inclusive is the player's representation in a game.
Yeah.
So, I've had so many experiences in games where I was all excited to go into character customization, only to find out that out of all of the options available, none of them reflected or represented me. So there's this element of character customization that can feel disheartening. Like you're trying to build a representation of yourself in this fantastical virtual world where anything is possible except for being yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And this type of representation in VR is so important because players come to your game with a lifetime of lived experiences. And some of them may want to bring those lived experiences into your virtual world.
Yeah.
So giving players a wide variety of options for different skin tones or styles or textures of hair, or options for scars or marks or disabilities, that'll help them feel more welcome in your game. And hey, guess what? That has the side benefit of making your games even more diverse, which is kind of the point, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, and there's other reasons for having, these options in your games too. For example, if you're in a social VR game where you're, I don't know, exploring a landscape with a group of friends, the assumption that everyone can move in the same way actually changes when you have representative visuals like a wheelchair, a walking cane, or a prosthetic. And similarly, maybe in that same social world, you want your avatar to have like a hearing aid so that those friends can see that you're hard of hearing. These types of visuals can help your player communicate things to the world around them, even without speaking.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, another thing I, want people to consider is to stay away from associating character customization elements or items with gender. Making short hair only available on masculine characters or long hair only available on feminine ones can feel less inclusive. And even further, forcing players to choose from a binary is also limiting. I mean, it's virtual reality. Let people play whatever they want.
Yeah, exactly. I know when I customize my character, I'm always super particular about making it look just right.
Yeah.
I sometimes say that I spend more time in the character customizer than the actual game. But sometimes that's not even about making my avatar look exactly like me. It's about making it look how I want to be represented in a specific game world.
Yes, I remember actually when we first started gaming together, I had so much fun kind of reintroducing myself all over again to like your online personality.
Yeah.
It really felt like I was getting to know this whole different version of you. And I think that's how you know that character customization is really working, when you can see someone as they truly want to be seen.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And yes, it's such a huge deal. It's so important to your players that you got to be thinking about these types of options.
Absolutely. I know there's a lot to think about when you're thinking about inclusive design, right? And I know it can feel overwhelming at times, but I actually think it could be broken down pretty simply. Inclusive design is good design.
Yeah.
And when more people can play your game, you'll have a better chance at finding success. All right. Well, as we wrap up this chat today, I want to call attention to the folks at home for a new feature on the MetaQuest store. After the launch of the Accessibility VRCs back in 2019, we were able to gather some valuable data on how many of our developers were implementing accessible design into their applications. And pulling from that data, we have a new shelf live now called Play Your Way on the store that features applications where you can customize your experience with different accessibility settings. Well, we're at the end of our time, Tom. I'll pass it to you for your final thoughts.
Sure, thanks. I think, honestly, the main point I'd like to end on is one that you mentioned earlier, and that's inclusive design is good design.
Yes.
I think anything that makes you really break down the aspects of your game systems to their fundamental components and analyze how they could be expected to work against a variety of use cases will help improve your designs. And designing for accessibility and inclusion is an amazing way to gain insight into those types of use cases. Beyond that, listen to your audience, and be open to feedback and learning. You're not going to get everything right the first time, and that's okay. But it's important to continue to ask those hard questions early and design for accessibility and inclusion from day one.
Yes. And for me, just know that, again, designing inclusively benefits everyone. Gamers like Tom and I and so many others will thank you for thinking about us and including us in your vision for VR. Tom, there's nothing I love more than chatting with you. I can't thank you enough for stopping by and sharing your insights on inclusive design.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. And it's always great to be talking to you, but especially when we're able to talk about such an important issue. And I really do hope that similar discussions and more importantly, action will be happening across the industry as we're moving toward this future of immersive VR experiences. Thanks, Marty.
All right. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you at next year's Connect.